Hi, this is Everett, Everett's Watercolors. Welcome to my classroom. Today I'm going to do a painting of trees and a roadway, and with lots of texture. I got a couple reference photographs here that I used. The top one there shows the row of trees with a roadway and a shadow pattern coming across the roadway. And the bottom photograph shows a lot of bark with the rough texture and some background. I took both of these pictures and I created a composition. And you see my little drawing over there on the right. That sketch shows the roadway with some trees and rough bark. So I'm really looking forward to this, and you can come along with me and see me how I do it. So let's go to my painting table and let's get started. Oh, here's the design drawing I have that's showing the trees. I'm going to do the bark and then the roadway. And the trees, there's a little stump there, and that other tree on the other side, and the background trees. Now this is my sketch that I'm going to use to design my painting. And I transferred that drawing over to a piece of quarter sheet of watercolor paper. And here I'm mixing up my colors using cerulean blue and yellow ochre. And I'm going to wet the background with a little 2-inch brush. And wet the background first with plain water, and then I start putting in the light background colors. I had done this ahead of time, so here I'm just showing you what I did as a result. And then with a medium-sized round brush, silver brush, I'm going to paint in the background trees. So I take some more of that blue color, a little bit of cobalt blue, a little bit of cerulean, and I go and put in the background trees with another layer of blue. As you get darker in your values, those shapes start to come forward. So those background trees are still in the background, but they're a little bit forward of actually the background sky, light blue sky color. So this identifies the background trees, and that's about all I'm going to do with them, just identify those shapes back there for background interest. So this brush and the blue paint does a very good job of doing that. I'm going to mix up a little bit of light value peacock blue. I'm using peacock blue and green number 1. I'm going to make those green leaves a light value to put in. Start working on the middle ground, but to start with a light value first. And first step I always do, I test the mixture, make sure it's the right value, the right color I want to show. So a little test sheet just to verify you've got the right color you want before you go to your painting. And then I start painting on those background trees, or it's actually a middle ground tree there, but I'm getting the lighter value for the foliage on those middle ground tree. Again, this is the light value. Work on the light values first. I always start with light values and I start adding darker values as I come forward. So we're going to have a light value middle ground. Little middle ground bushes back there, the low bushes there next to the horizon line. Again, using the same colors for that particular area. I'll pick up tissue. I'm going to take off some of that color I put there in the background. Just keep that value light. I pick it up with a tissue. It's always good to have some tissues around to do that. If your color gets too dark, you can just pick it right up. I continue on in the middle ground, adding some of those low bushes with that light green color. Now I'm going to mix up another green, or really it's really green and yellow. I'm going to put a brown mixed into this also. Give me a little brown mix with a little bit of green, and it'll be like a middle value color for those low lying bushes in the middle ground. I'm using a 1/2-inch silver brush flat to mix and also to apply this to the painting. little bit of yellow ochre also mixed in with that green. It'll give me a nice, it's not really yellow, it's not really green, it's kind of a mixture. I'll start back there in the middle ground. Now as I come forward in the painting, the colors get a little brighter. Not the brightest so far, but a little brighter, a little more color as I come forward in the painting. Here I'm using that 1/2 inch silver brush, and I'm using the edges of the brush, the corner of the brush, to shape those bushes along the middle ground. And also here I come into the foreground. I'm also going to take that color and put it in certain places along the edge of the road. And here I really test a little bit about what color I'm going to use here in the foreground. So I'll put some real color there. And I continue to do that. Once I put a color somewhere, I try to repeat that color in other parts of the painting to provide continuity and to unify the painting with the same colors. That's always a good idea. I continue on in the middle ground with that, I call it a warm green. It's got more yellow and brown in it, but it's a green with mixed in with brown. And also getting working on the shapes with that corner of that brush. I want those bushes to have a little shape to them. But here I'm just putting in the first color. I'm just going to put in the shape and a little bit of the beginning color to define those shapes there in the middle ground, those low-lying bushes. And I'll come into the foreground now and take that color. Also, I'm testing about what color I want to use in the foreground, and also for continuity to have the same colors throughout the whole painting, not just in one spot. Now going back into the middle ground again a little bit there on the edge. Adding in some of that green now, a little more green back there. Even in a fall scene, you might have some greens mixed in with the browns. This is kind of the season now is probably late summer. The bushes are still there, but they're starting to turn brown. You still got some greenery in the trees and also on the ground bushes. So I'm using that mixture to give me a kind of a brownish greens mixture. The start of early fall. I'm going to pick up a little bit of burnt sienna with that flat brush. And I'm going to work a little bit on the contour of the road. I'm going to work on the edge of the road. It'll give me a little definition, a little dimension. Also a little contrast. Really basically texture. I'm trying to get a rough edge. Trying to show the shape. Getting a beginning color of the road. I'm going to use browns and some other colors in there. I'll be working on this later on, but here's just a starting point. Getting some color in each area of the painting. And over here I'm working on that stump. Again, a beginning color. I'll use that burnt sienna, which is kind of a middle value. It's also more colorful than the other colors, so it's coming forward. So it'll have a little bit more eye-catching color. It's a little bit brighter, a little bit stronger in the foreground. I'm just painting that little old stump over there on the left-hand side. It gives me a little interesting shape. Something different than some of the shapes on the right side of the road. Adding some more marks, a little more brush strokes in the foreground. Mixing in some of that burnt sienna in with that other color. Again, just trying different colors out there to see which one I'm going to go with. Same way on the right. Again, making both sides with the same colors, not separating the colors, but to use the colors on both sides. Again, for continuity and unity. So I was starting the light colors. Now I'm going to start mixing up some darker colors now. I'm going to start working on some of the tree shapes. So I'm mixing a little bit of blue, a little bit of cobalt blue in with that brown burnt sienna. And there I'm putting in the dark trees in the background. The darker trees will give it a little silhouette of a tree there in the background behind those forward trees. And here I'm using that middle size round brush again. Again, I'm working in a smaller area, so a smaller brush will do the job much better. I always use the brush that fits the size of the shape that you're painting on. The big brush is fine for large areas, but when you get into little areas like this, you want to use a smaller brush. And the round brush does a great job on small places like this. Putting that dark trunk in there. And I'm putting the dark against the light too. You'll see the dark contrast of that tree against the lighter colors of the middle ground bushes there. Again, that gives us some interest. Putting lights against darks also gives it a good contrast. Will give it a good viewpoint for your eye to follow. So it's a good principle in art to have light against dark to give a little interest in the painting. Wherever you can put contrast makes your painting that much better. There's another tree there. This is in the middle ground, sort of the middle ground. We're working on the middle ground trees. Here's another dark tree. I mixed a different color now. I put a little bit of green in with that mixture with the brown. So when I paint a darker color, whether it's whatever color it is, I always mix in another color with it. It kind of vary the colors. Even though it's a tree trunk, it should not be the same color all the way down or even the same color as another tree trunk. There should be a little variety. A little bit of color change always makes the painting a lot more interesting. So here I put a little bit of green in with that mixture. You can use whatever colors that would be good there. It's kind of it's a medium dark color. It's not the darkest color yet, but it's a medium dark color. When it dries, remember watercolor dries about 40% lighter. Now here I'm going to take that tissue again, and I'm going to, because that is darker than I want, I'm going to take up a little bit of that color just by dabbing it with the tissue. Not to make it so dark there, because we're still in the middle ground. I don't want to put too dark yet. So by using a tissue to pick that color up while it's still wet, it's easy to take away that color and make it lighter. And working a little more color along the edge of the road, a little more definition. I'm working on texture. I'm going to work on some darker shadow areas in the middle ground along that bushes. Some dark areas that are shadows inside the bushes. Again, I'm just building the shapes up a little bit. Put a little darker color. That green mixed in with that brown will give me that darker green. It makes it an olive green, like it's a little bit of green mixed in with brown gives you like an olive color. Still a middle value. A little shadow pattern there in that bush here, and then those bushes there in the middle ground. And all the values will be different. I put a little darker in some areas, keep it a little bit lighter in certain areas. So you want to vary the values also. Don't want to look all the same. Different brush strokes. Here I'm using a round brush, that middle-sized round brush, but then I'm putting the value and the color into that area. And I'm using different kinds of brush strokes, little tiny marks, shaping that value, which is a little darker than, dark against light. But I know already that the colors will, when it dries, watercolor dries a lot lighter, so I got to make sure I put it in dark enough because I know it's going to lighten up when it dries. Now moving into the foreground, adding in some of that dark shadow areas around the base of the tree. Building texture. I'm going to pick up a little bit of that darker area there in the middle ground, just to keep the values a little bit lighter in that middle ground area. Adding some texture here in the foreground around the base of that tree, bushes and twigs and so forth that are growing here in the foreground, casting shadows, using that darker value to break up the shapes, give us some interest. Now moving over to the left side, adding in some of those darker values also. Again, just putting in colors right now that I'm going to be adding to later on, but right now just getting something started. I'm really testing out the colors a little bit, adding a little value into certain areas, like that tree trunk there in the background, just give a little more definition. Bring it forward. As I add more color to it, it brings it forward in the painting. Adding a little more color to the middle ground, a little more green, a little more texture. Again, this painting really is going to be a lot of texture because I'm working on these areas. Give a little more brushwork here to give it a look like a bush with leaves. So the small marks and so forth gives it the texture look. And I'm adding color now, leaving some of the white showing, the light values show, but then put the darker values in there for definition. This helps define what the area is. These are bushes with leaves and different colors and so forth. I'm mixing up a little more green. Define that roadway. Give myself a little more contrast back there along the edge of that road. To put a little darker value back in there to define the edge of that road going into the background. Another color mix. Let's start a little bit of blue mixed in with some greens. Trying to make up a little, maybe a little gray color, a little light brown, a little bit of yellow ochre. So I'm going to start working on these trees here in the foreground. So this big tree in the foreground, I'm going to start with a light color first. That's yellow ochre. And this will show the kind of a background color of the tree, the base color, yellow ochre, a light brown. Again, I'm using a 1/2-inch flat brush, a natural hair silver brush, and I'm putting in the colors into the limbs and the large trunk of that right tree on the right hand side of the road. This is the foreground. This is really a part of the center of interest would be this big tree up here. So I'm taking my time, using the edge of the brush and the side of the brush. Again, putting the colors in. Moving over to the left side. The tree on the left hand side is more limbs. You'll notice the tree on the right will have a lot of leaves. The one on the left hand side will have a lot of limbs. So that's a variety here. I got two trees in the foreground that really are the main characters of this painting, and I've got one with more limbs versus the other one which has more leaves. So again, that's a variety in the composition. And also I'm going to be able to show more texture in these large trees with the large trunks and the large limbs. So this is really the part of the painting which is going to take the most of the detail. So this light color defines, it's the base color of the tree trunk, which is a light valued yellow ochre type color, light brown. And also in the roadway, using that same color, going back into the roadway with a little bit of that yellow ochre. Again, using the same colors throughout the painting, so there's not one color isn't isolated all by itself. There's a continuity of colors throughout the painting. That yellow ochre is in different parts. Now I'm mixing up the light green, the darker greens now. The greens are going to be in the tree on the right. I'm going to mix up the green number 1, mixed in a little bit of hooker's green. I want a nice rich green color, not just one color, so I'm mixing the greens together to give me a mix for that green, for that right hand tree. And also I'm introducing a little bit of yellow, lemon yellow. Again, another variety of green. So I have a light value, a middle value, and a dark value of green for that one tree. And then a little bit of burnt sienna. That burnt sienna mixed in with the green will give me that olive color. So I've got really 4 colors there in my mixture. So they'll be part of that tree on the right hand side, those colors right there, right now, for a starter. And I mixed in yellow ochre green in with that burnt sienna. That gives me even a darker green. So there's my mixes for green. I've got a nice combination of yellows, greens mixed in with burnt sienna. And that'll give me a nice combination of different colors of green. And that's what you want to do when you do a tree or something like this of these colors. You want to get a mixture that has a variety of colors so that you can get a good feel for what you want. Now I'm using a bristle brush here, an old bristle brush, to apply the leaves. That gives me the texture that I'm looking for. Remember, this whole painting is about texture. So just by using this old bristle brush, which you can buy at any hardware store. This is a very inexpensive brush, but it does a great job on making leaves because it's a stiff bristle, but also gives you a nice textured look. Here's a smaller bristle. You get several small shapes of bristle brushes. Here's a smaller shaped bristle brush. But that stiff bristle gives you a very, very irregular brush stroke, which is what you want. So putting that color on there with a bristle brush, here I've tried this out and it works out very well. I really like the way that texture looks. Now here is the half-inch flat brush. Now I'm doing is spreading out more of the color. So here for a bigger area or a larger area to paint, I'm using the flat half-inch natural brush. But for the texture and for the edges, I use the bristle brush. And here you can notice I'm using a variety of those colors, the browns, the greens, the yellows. And I'm working on the edges and the texture of those leaves to give it a real nice identification that this tree has got a lot of leaves in it. And the browns, of course, is the season of the year where the leaves are starting to turn brown. So it's still got some brown mixed in with those greens. So this is a good way, and I'm leaving a little white space also. You'll see little little pieces of white still shown on that around the area of those leaves. I leave white paper to give me a little sparkle. Also, it creates the illusion of texture, but really to give me a real nice variety of colors. The yellows, the greens, the browns, mixed in with two kinds of greens. And then the brush stroke, leaving little white specks here and there, a little variety there. Working on the edge pattern with the edge of the brush, corner of the brush, to give me that texture. The edge of the trees are very important because you want those leaves to look like leaves, where they'll have points and edges that are rough. There'll be hard edges, but that's what you want. Hard edges will show up better than soft edges, so you want a hard edge. And here I'm filling in around those light areas now, putting in more brush strokes, using a flat brush with the side of the brush, the corner of the brush, picking up different colors as I go down to the palette. Pick up a different color. More yellows over here. The yellows indicate the direction of the sunlight. So the yellow colors on the right indicate that this is the lightest part of the tree where the sun is shining from. So that gives you an idea of the source of light and where it's coming from. So you put your lighter colors, your yellows, your light greens, and your lightest values in the area where the source of light is. So that yellow is going to indicate the location of the sun, which is hitting on that right side of the tree. Adding in some more of those browns again to give the texture and the season of the tree, the time of year that it could be in, mixed in with those greens. And now I'm working on the edges, working on the shapes of those leaves with the corner of the brush. You'll notice the brush strokes. I'm using the corner, turn the brush on the side, go back, I pick up another color. So it's all, the whole lesson here about this is a variety of brush strokes, a variety of color, even a little variety of value. You'll see little darker areas, and you'll see lighter areas. And here I'm going to pull out the spray bottle. I've got the dot spray bottle, pound the bottle with green number 1 mixed in a dot spray bottle, and here I'm adding texture on top of those brush strokes. And here's one with lemon yellow, a dot spray bottle. And again, that'll give texture. The dot spray gives you a coarse pattern, just a light tapping motion. Just a light tapping motion on that bottle will give you those nice shapes of leaves. Going back, adding a little more color in with that spray bottle. A little touch of darker greens. Again, the value change, lights and darks. Now with those same colors, I'm going to move over to the left side. I'm going to paint in some of those leaves. Now these are really background colors behind some of the branches, so that these colors here are really the backgrounds, or the middle ground leaves and colors behind this tree on the left, which is going to be mostly branches. But there's colors behind it that has leaves and trees and the tree shapes and the tree colors. So I'm using the same colors back there. Not as much detail. The less detail back there indicates that it's further away. The shapes are less defined. It's just an indication that there are colors back there, similar colors that are here in the foreground, but yet further away. So there's less detail back there. But again, the colors are important to show what's there. Using that bristle brush, a small bristle brush, going by to give a little bit of texture here around this forward tree. Just a little texture, a little touch. Not as much detail, but just a little bit to indicate that, you know, those are leaves back there, a little leaf shape, a little leaf, a little edge, a little change in the shape there. Give it an indication of what it is. Those are just hints that those are leaves on those trees in the background. That's all that is, just a hint. So the edge of a shape indicates what it is. Edges are very important. So this bristle brush does a great job on painting those edges. Gives me a rough, irregular shape, which is what I want. But it gives me the texture I'm looking for, which is just it looks like a tree, it looks like a branch, it looks like a leaf. So it gives me that rough outline that I want with that brush stroke. So this little old bristle brush does a great job for doing that particular texture. It gave me the look of leaves, the edges, and just the irregularity of that brush stroke, of that brush, along with that color, to give me the shape of those background leaves on those background trees. Excellent job by that brush. Now looking forward to working on one of the most interesting parts of the painting, these foreground trees. I'm mixing up a dark color using burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. That dark brown will be the color I'm going to use on these trunks. Starting with the right side tree, I'm going to start putting in some details with this medium-sized number 8 brush made by Silver Brush. And all these brushes in this video are available on my website, www.everettwatercolors.com. Now the characteristic of this tree is I'm painting some grooves, and I'm using a lot of artistic license here. So I'm interpreting the grooves in this particular tree to be a unique shape, different sizes, different lengths, and different widths. And referring back to the reference photograph, which I showed in the beginning of the video, you can see all those grooves that are in that tree trunk on that top photograph there. So I'm using it as a reference, but I'm also making changes as I go along. Also putting darker value along the edge to identify the edge of the tree next to that light middle ground. So here I'm using contrast, light against dark, to bring that tree forward. I'm going to take my time here. I'm going to go ahead and design the grooves in here and make them unique. My goal here is to make each one different, a different size, a different length, a different width, and even a little color change using that brown and blue paint combination. And the round brush is a good brush to use here in this kind of area where you want to put a little detail. I'll put some dots and dashes and little marks in the bark. Remember, this is a texture of the tree that I'm interpreting here. And the whole theme of this painting was to get the texture of trees, along with the texture in the roadway, which I'll get to later. And using the round brush and the dark value paint mix, I'll continue on defining the edges of the grooves, the different marks. Again, I'm not following a photograph. I'm just using my own interpretation here. Now up here in the limbs, up here in the taller upper parts of the tree, I can use some of the shadow pattern that is cast by the leaf structures up here. So that'll help me also get some of that dark value up there. So again, I'm interpreting the leaf pattern that would cast a shadow onto those upper leaves of this tree, the branches. Again, I'm using light against dark along the edges to give me more definition of the shape. And continuing on with putting in small marks to show the characteristic of this particular tree that I see here. And I'm developing this as I go along. Again, identifying more parts of the tree, upper branches, taking advantage of the shadow pattern from some of these leaves up here in the higher parts of the tree. The round brush gives me a chance to make these long, narrow marks, characteristic of the grooves that I'm trying to capture here. Again, this is my interpretation of this particular bark structure on this tree. And I use the reference photograph as an idea to give me that particular look. Taking advantage of lights against darks. And I'm also trying to develop a minimal number of brush strokes I'm using up here. Just enough brush strokes, enough color changes, enough contrast to define the area. I don't have to paint it all. I don't have to fill in all the spaces, but just enough to give the characteristic of what I'm painting. I'll let the viewer fill in the blanks or fill in the areas that aren't filled in. So a viewer has their own interpretation of what they see. And up there and above there, I'm capturing some more of the branches up in the top part of the tree. Again, putting dark against light. Painting between the leaves, around the leaves. Taking advantage of putting dark against light wherever I can in order to define that shape. Adding a few more marks, again, dots and dashes, little marks, little characteristics, make it different. I don't want all the marks to be the same. I'm trying to make each mark different, each little shape different. No repetition, as minimum as possible. And also minimizing the number of brush strokes I need here in order to identify that tree. Okay, now I'm going to do the same thing on the left side of the other tree, which is also in the foreground. And taking advantage here that this particular tree is primarily limbs, where the tree I just finished has a lot of leaves on it. This particular tree has a proportionally more amount of limbs or branches. Even though these are two trees that are basically the same type of tree, I'm going to paint each one differently. So I'm giving this characteristic tree more of the branch effect and less leaves. And the characteristic will be similar as far as the grooves and so forth. But when you have two subjects that are similar, like two trees or two objects, you try to make the other one object different from the other in certain ways. Here I'm doing a different internal structure of the grooves, different characteristic of this tree. Each tree is different, just like people. Each person has a different characteristic. Every tree is not the same. Every tree has its own particular characteristic. So I'm trying to capture this one with a different feeling of branches, with the shadow patterns, the bark structure. Again, the texture here is capturing the grooves, using dark against light for contrast. The colors are basically the same here on this tree, but the shape and the sizes of the grooves and the direction and the angles will be different. And here I'm putting in a darker value at this point around that forward stump. There's a stump in front of this tree, which again makes it a different, something different on the left side than the right side of the painting. Here I have a stump and a tree, and on the other side is just a tree. So again, it's a variety of shapes, a variety of objects, a variety of elements. Here I'm putting a dark value around that stump, taking advantage of the lights and darks to define that shape, a different contrast. If you notice, basically when you're looking at a landscape or any object, the characteristic and the depth of that particular shape or size is defined by the value. The dark value against the light value defines the shape. And here I'm building the characteristic grooves on this particular tree, which will be different from the one on the right. That's my objective. Here's to make it different. Using the same round brush, medium size number 8 silver brush. Natural hair. Comes to a nice fine point. Also holds a lot of paint. It's a nice brush to have for watercolor. Here I'm building up the groove patterns in this particular tree, and making them different from the one on the right. There'll be some similarities, but there'll also be a lot of differences. One thing, basically what an artist tries to do is make something interesting in the painting so that you go back and look at it again and again and find something different. That's the objective of the artist. Now here I'm going to work put a little darks here on this forward stump here. Again, it was an old tree, it was cut down, but it still had the characteristic grooves on the bark pattern. Probably very similar, but again, I'm putting in some marks there to identify the shape of that bark or the texture of that bark on that small stump to make it part of the story. Here are the darks against the lights, gives the contrast, gives me the shape and a different value, and keeps the characteristic of what I'm painting there. Now I went ahead a little further ahead and put in some shadow patterns in that tree trunk on the left, and I'm adding some more branches. I'm using a large number 16 round brush, which is made by Holbein. It's a Holbein watercolor brush. It's a large round, but it does a beautiful job. It holds a lot of paint and comes to a nice sharp point. So it makes a nice brush to use for little details like brushes, like branches. Comes to a nice sharp point. So I'm using this round brush here to capture the branches on this tree on the left hand side. As you can see here, the difference of this tree is it has a lot more branches. I got a few leaves there that I'm connecting. There's very minor, but just a few leaves that I'm connecting with the branches. But primarily, 95% of this tree is all branches. So this number 16 round brush is doing a good job of giving me a nice fine point to give me the characteristic of those branches coming off the main trunk and the main branches itself. Round brush will give me a lot of nice detail with small marks. I'm adding a small branch over here to this tree on the right. Now you'll notice this is a very important element because what I'm doing here is adding a branch on this particular trunk. And what I'm doing is I'm overlapping that branch, overlapping the middle ground. And what that does with that dark value of that branch, it pushes the middle ground back so that that tree looks even more forward, separating the middle ground from the foreground with another element and a different value. So that's a very important element in this particular painting. Even though it's a small area, it makes a big difference. Continue to add more little details, little dots and dashes. This is a place where you take your time. This is the impact area or the focal point of the painting, so it needs to have a little more attention, a little more detail, higher contrast, more colorful. All those things makes that the impact area of the painting, the focal point. Building more interest and more definition, little detail. I'm taking my time here, so I want this to be representative of this particular subject of the painting. Adding a little more contrast there in the leaf structure, a little more shadow. Also emphasizing here that I'm trying to also minimize the number of marks. The areas I'm doing are just little touches to define the bark, to define the tree structure, but to minimize the number of strokes, the amount of strokes that I do. I decided here to add another branch over here on this tree and take it across to push the middle ground back even more. I think there's another branch here on the left side overlapping that middle ground tree to push it back. So here's another example of adding an element in the foreground that's darker than the middle ground to push that middle ground element back behind. It's a good technique. I've noticed you're going to add a little bit of dot spray bottle here, my palette in a bottle dot spray. They're available only on my Everett Watercolor website, exclusively sold by Everett Watercolors. Palette in a bottle. Here I'm adding a little highlight of yellow. This gives me a little splash, a little light touch. A little light touch gives me a nice spray pattern, a little dots pattern. And these spray bottles work great. I have all my colors in my dot spray bottles and my fine mist bottles. And here I have a dot spray with green number 1. Put a few more dots up there, just a little more texture. In the tree. Adding a little more color. Now if I put color there, I'm going to put color somewhere else. So I'm going to bring it down into the middle ground. into the foreground. So if I put color in one area, I'm going to try to repeat that same color somewhere else in the painting, not be isolated in one spot. But also to make a different size or different shape in the other areas, so it doesn't become distracting. So that's for continuity, where you want to add elements of color or value. You want to move them around the painting to be consistently unified. Also noticed here on the right of this tree, because it's light here with the sun hitting it, that white paper on the tree is really the sunlight hitting that tree. I'm going to add a little more contrast here in the middle ground against that light area of the foreground tree. Again, that'll push this forward tree even further forward by putting a darker value behind. So here I'm taking advantage of adding a darker contrast, a darker color next to that light color there in the foreground to separate the two, and also to bring that foreground element forward. Also adding some more color. I put down some initial colors there in the beginning, just to create the shapes and so forth. Now I'm adding a little more color in the middle ground, and also I'll do more color in the foreground to give it a more color, more exciting viewpoint. Also building texture in those bushes back there. The objective of this painting was to create texture. Here I'm creating texture back in the foliage, the bushes. I'm using that big number 16 round brush again. It comes in very handy for a watercolor painting. Holds lots of paint. Adding more elements here. I'm adding a little more value here to the foreground. It's a little light up here, so I want to put a little more value change. The middle ground has got a middle value there in the green, and it's got a light value in the yellow. Now I'm putting a darker value forward of that. Again, I'm putting a dark against the light on the ground. It's also to break up the shapes, and also brings that dark color forward because it's a different value. Adding a dark value gives me a chance to build texture. Also gives me a colorful way to add color on top of what's there. So I'm adding a color change, I'm adding a value change, and I'm building up more interest here in the foreground, right next to that impact area, which is the large right tree. So in watercolor, you're building up layers. You got a light layer, then on top of that you can put another color that will make it darker. You can darken that layer so that the original layer still shows through, but you're putting another layer around it or next to it or even overlapping it to give it a different color. These are also shadow patterns cast from objects off to the right of the scene, casting shadows across the ground. So these can also be part of the shadow pattern on the ground of this landscape. And I think adding those dark colors up there really brings out the texture and brings that whole area a little more into tune with the impact area. It gives the impact area a lot more importance now with that darks up here next to the lights. And adding a little more back in the background. Now if I change some colors and values in one area, I'm going to change values and colors in other areas. For continuity, I want to be able to add color changes and value changes to other different parts of the painting, to unify the structures and to unify the overall painting. You don't want to have colors or values in isolation. You want to have a variety of colors and a variety of values throughout the painting, both in the background and in the foreground. And here I'm minimizing the darker values in the middle ground, but they can be shadow patterns. There can be cast shadows from different elements in the landscape. So it reads well. It reads the fact that you're going back into the painting. It should be some darker areas back there because of the cast shadows. So I'm really looking at all the elements. Here I'm adding a little more texture, a little more value up into the leaves. Remember, watercolor dries about 40% lighter, and if you don't make it dark enough, it's going to get light. So here I'm adding a little more color, a little more value, a little darker value to bring out those leaf shapes and the texture in the leaves, adding a little more color to give a little more contrast, to darken up those areas that got light with the watercolor painting had dried and had lightened down. Using a variety of color, I put greens and browns, even parts of the yellows, just a mixture of colors. Not trying to stay with the same colors that are there, not getting too opposite of what's there, but using similar colors that are already there. Adding green to the green area, adding brown to the brown area. Otherwise, I would cover up that original color and maybe get something and not what I want to see. Now over on the left, I'm not going to avoid the leftover. I'm going to add some color over here, a little more texture. Even in the foreground on the left, add a little more color. There's some green grass over on the left. I'm going to add in some brush strokes with a number 16 round brush. Green mixed in with brown, which is characteristic of this foreground. And the season we're talking about is probably late summer, early fall. You're going to have green grass or brown grass mixtures. Also the brush strokes. Here I'm making brush strokes that are characteristic of the ground, rough, rugged, marks that look like grass, little strokes up and down. So I'm mindful of where I am in the painting. If I'm working in an area, then the brush strokes and the sizes match that particular texture. Here I'm thinking about what I'm going to do next. Now I'm looking off to the right over here, and I see that my eye is going out to the right side of the painting here. So I'm going to add an element. And I call this element, I really call it an eye stopper, because this will stop the eye from going out. So I'm going to add a small tree over here on the right side. And it'll keep the viewer or the eyes from moving out to the right hand side. That light area is very distracting when you're looking at the overall painting. So by adding this element, this tree, the tree trunk and some limbs, it will prevent the viewer from looking beyond the outside or the edge of the painting. So this is very important, that you keep the elements inside the painting and not let elements go on the outside. That particular light area was an area that needed to be improved on. So that's what I call a view stopper. By putting something on the edge or around the edges that would prevent
the viewer from going outside. You could add a value out there or an element. Here I added a tree. And here again, I'm going to start mixing up some colors here for the roadway. I'm going to have a light value in the roadway colors, a light value of yellow ochre, and then I'm going to have a medium value of burnt sienna, and a darker value of quinacridone violet. Now I'm going to use the 3/4 inch silver brush, flat brush, natural hair, and I'm going to start in the background, and I'm going to have light value in the background of this road, and I'll probably leave that first part of the road white, then I'll start adding the yellow ochre next as I'm coming forward. Then I'm going to use a dry brush stroke, which I lay the brush down flat and I drag it, and that gives me a broken brush stroke. It gives me the texture and ruggedness of the surface. A dry brush stroke will give me the characteristic of that particular surface, which is a rough road. Then I pick up the burnt sienna, which is a darker color. As I come forward, use the same brush stroke, dry brush, drag it along the flat of the paper, giving the characteristic of a broken, rough surface, rugged surface. Then the quinacridone violet, which is my darker color, it's going to be in the forward part of the road. So I go from light to dark, moving forward from the background into the foreground to give me the characteristic of distance. And those strokes now with the flat brush, with a dry brush stroke, gives me the texture of the roadway. Now, the most important part of this whole painting is the light's coming from right to left. So I'm now looking at the edge of the road, and I'm going to start putting in a shadow pattern. And I'm using quinacridone violet mixed in with blue to give me a shadow color, which will be a bluish violet. And I'm going to put in the edge of the road shadow pattern. So as the light comes from right to left, there'll be a cast shadow along this edge of the road from those bushes and the edge of the contour of the road and the contour of the landscape. There'll be a shadow pattern along this right edge of this part of the road. I'm using a 3/4 inch flat brush, and I'm using a side stroke, just coming down and putting that shadow pattern along the edge of the road. Yeah, that's the cast shadow from the trees and the bushes and so forth, and the edge of the contour of the road, cast shadow along the edge of that. Then I've got a shadow over here that's being cast onto the top of this tree stump. So I'm putting in now a little shadow pattern of a cast shadow on the top of this stump. So that's white, that's a white surface, but I'm putting the shadow pattern on top of that to give a little interest over here on this white paper. So that's a cast shadow on top of that tree stump. Using the corner of the brush, the edge of the brush, to put that stroke in. And now your little shadow to the shadow side of that stump itself. Now using the same color, the quinacridone violet, we're mixing a little bit of blue. Now comes the most important part of what I think the painting really has. It's the shadow pattern across the roadway. This will give it dimension, also interest. So starting here in the background, the cast shadow from these trees and bushes across the roadway. Each painting of the shadow should be unique, different size, different width. I'm using the 3/4 inch flat brush loaded with the paint, and I'm using the corner of the brush to give me a nice small line using the corner of the brush. And it's going to follow the contour of the road. It's going to come down the hill or the pathway through the bushes, and then the tree is going to cast a shadow across the road. And it's going to be a different shadow pattern. I'm going to make it different than the other one. One will be larger, smaller, narrower, wider. Also showing the contour of the road itself, the little bumps and grooves in the road. So the shadow pattern is interesting. It follows the contour of the landscape and also simulates the shadow coming from an element in the landscape being cast on another part of the landscape. So that part there was a background tree coming across the road. Now we'll get into the large tree here in the foreground. And it's a bigger tree, so it'll have a much bigger shadow going across the pathway, roadway. Again, thinking about making each shadow a different size, a different shape. It'll basically follow the same sort of contour because of the road is sort of flat here at this point with little grooves in the road. It's going to follow the contour, so if there's little grooves or edges of the road, it'll show the contour of the road and this edge of the road. So here I'm planning the edge of the road to show the contour and the roughness using the corner of the brush. And I'm going to make this shadow a lot bigger. It's going to go across the whole surface. You take your time here. This is an important part of the painting, and just to make it different, there's a thought process here of thinking about what you want to, how you want to add the shape and so forth. But basically, the contours are already defined. You're just putting in an element here for interest. You want the eye to follow across the shadow pattern, and it gives you a very interesting shape, and also adds texture to this part of the painting. Remember, the key element in this whole painting is texture. The texture in the road, the texture in the grass and bushes. Also, to make sure, most important, the texture of the trees, showing the rough bark and the rough contrast of the shapes. You know, I'm taking my time here, building up the shadow gradually, adding more and more dimension to it as I add more color. The lesson here is to take your time and gradually build up the shadow pattern. Study the shapes, study the value you want to add I'm studying the contour of the sides of the road. Now, using that bristle brush, I'm going to add in the texture now of some of the, there's some grass growing down the middle of that road. So I'm adding a little bit of color just for variety. You got all those purples there and blues. Just by adding a little bit of greenery in there gives it another change. Now taking a fine rigger brush with some dark color of burnt sienna with a little bit of blue, added in a texture here of some bushes, some stems and tall weeds, adding those into the foreground. Adding more detail to the road, a little more ruts, a little more grooves, using that dark shadow pattern, showing the center of the road, a little more definition. Again, a little more, just basically a little more texture marks here with a small brush. Just adding a little detail. These are some fine points you can add to a painting to give a little more interest. Well, I hope you found this painting interesting. The main theme here was to capture texture of the trees and the roadway going back into the deep woods. So I really had a good time painting this, and hope you enjoyed it. And try a painting like this and submit it to my Facebook page, Fun with Watercolors. My link is in the description below the video. I call this painting Roadway and Trees Textures. And there's the final painting. It really turned out great. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and give me a thumbs up. It helps with my ratings. See you on the next video.